Hi, everybody. It's Tuesday and it's close of business, and we have a really exciting, really dynamic, particularly interesting show today. I think as many of you have heard over the weeks that we've been doing discussions, India and China keep coming up as top topics in almost any conversation. It could be the transition discussion, it could be just supply demand, it could be the global economy. And so today we're dedicating the entire discussion to India. I've got the usual crew here with me, Mike Bradley, Matt Portillo, and Colin Fenton. We'll do some upfront, but then we're really excited, as I say, to have a phenomenal India panel that through our friends out there have decided to join us, and so we really want to thank them. Gauri Jauhar is she's executive director of the Transition and Clean Tech Consulting Practice for IHS in India, and she's joining us from New Delhi. We've got Mohit Saraf, who's a senior partner at L&L Partners, which is a well-regarded, very influential law firm. He's also joining us from New Delhi. We have Rajiv Gupta, who's joining us from Singapore. He's the partner in charge of India for Latham & Watkins. And we have our dear friend, David Blumenthal, who we've known for so long. He's joining us from Hong Kong. He's in charge of Latham & Watkins energy practice in the region. So we've got a fantastic panel. We're just going to set the stage really quick before we get to the India discussion. Mike, talk to us about what's happening on the screen today.
Yeah, I hate to be a bearer of bad news, but it's just a sea of red today in the equity markets and commodities. And crude oil for the first time, Brent, is below $40 a barrel since June. And the question is, why is this happening today? You know, we've been talking about it for the last 4 or 5 weeks about Brent time spread weakness, and it's because of modest oversupply right now in the markets, and that seems to be catching up with the market. You know, what sparked off the sell-off today? I think a combination of things. You had Saudi lowering their OSPs to Asia here this last weekend. You've got basically, precious metals. The U.S. dollar has started to strengthen, and that has been a really big trade here over the last couple of months. It's taken precious metals like gold and silver and even Bitcoin up. And so it looks like just a bit of a unwind, and now you have also Brent breaking below technical levels. So it has to kind of hold $40 today. But right now it's just near-term fundamentals just look oversupplied, and we're seeing the brunt of it today.
Mike, unfair question. Or at least maybe I'm just hoping for something optimistic that's not there. But is part of the unwind taking some of the froth out of this market? That, ironically, as we head back towards normalcy, does that mean the market needs to reflect more normal valuation thinking, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's if you looked at technology over the last week, it's really come unwound, and people are talking about option trading and stuff like that going on. But I think the group was overbought, it's pulled back, and it's really generally a risk-off trade today. And energy is really kind of moving with technology as well. So near term, the fundamentals for crude oil look a bit sloppy right now, and so it's in its own little world. But yes, definitely a risk-off trade with the overall market is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It just doesn't feel good as it's happening, and that's where we are today.
Colin, do you make anything from the dollar strengthening? Do you think there's something going on here in underlying sentiment?
Yeah, sure. I think also, we've warned for some time that there are going to be two really important dates coming into the fourth quarter: the day after Labor Day, the U.S. holiday, and the U.S. presidential election date. And let's face it, there are all sorts of political forces that have all sorts of incentives to emphasize what is wrong or right with the world right now. And so I think part of what you are seeing is that spotlight being put on each of those aspects.
All right. Matt, I think you were going to tee us up with some thoughts you and your team had ahead of today's discussion.
Yeah, sure, Maynard. So as the research team continues to progress our work around energy transition and the transportation sector, we decided to put together a couple quick slides here just to give some context around the vehicle market in India. It is fairly unique in regards to the consumer preference relative to some of the OECD countries that we talk about with a lot of frequency. So I wanted to share a couple slides with you just to frame the context around how things have progressed. So as you can see, India is really a two-wheel vehicle market. I think there's a lot of focus on the passenger vehicle segment, which has grown very rapidly over the last 15 years. If you look at the bottom left-hand side of this chart, in 2004, 2005, new sales in India for passenger vehicles were about 1 million vehicles or 1 million units per year. That's grown at an extremely rapid pace, about 9% per annum. And the market is now one of the largest markets in the world for passenger vehicle sales at about 3.4 million units sold per year. That puts India right behind Germany, but makes it as important as a lot of the EU regions in terms of total sales. But really, the market is dominated by two-wheel and three-wheel vehicles. If you look at the same chart there at the very bottom, in 2004, 2005, we saw about 6.2 million units sold per year of two-wheel vehicles. And that has also grown at about 9% per annum to about 21 million units per year sold on two-wheel vehicles. So the market is very large. In terms of vehicles in use, just for some context, this is a little bit of a dated data set here, but in 2016, there were about 230 million vehicles on the road in India, which actually makes it pretty similar in size and scale to both China and the US. But again, it's a bit more dominated, or really actually quite dominated by those two-wheel vehicle sales. The government does have pretty lofty goals to electrify the auto fleet, but we would caution those seem to be very lofty at the moment. But by 2030, there are plans to essentially have about 30% of new vehicle sales be electrified. The real focus in the near term from some of the think tanks in country is really focused on that two-wheel and three-wheel market, trying to move towards electrification by the mid-2020s. So that's an area we'll be watching very closely. Now, in terms of incentive programs, in 2019, the government launched their second phase of the FAME program, which is planned to accelerate the adoption of EVs and hybrid vehicles in country. They've put about $1.4 billion of subsidies in place to essentially spur demand and infrastructure expansion. But the numbers here are kind of a drop in the bucket relative to the overall market size. So it's going to take a very long time for EVs under the current incentive schemes to make their way into the system. And just for some context, in 2019, electric vehicles represented well less than 1% of total sales. And almost all of those electric vehicles that were sold were two-wheel vehicles. The passenger vehicle market is still in its infancy relative to a lot of the more developed nations that we look at. Now, the market is huge. We are talking about a population of over 1.3 billion people. And the GDP growth here has been exceedingly strong over the last 20 years. But it is important to note that the GDP per capita at about $2,000 is well less than the world average, which is about $11,000. And so it's just going to take some time for that wealth generation to filter into the auto market. I think the other important thing to talk about here is infrastructure. Charging stations are still few and far between. Part of the incentive structure under FAME is to build out incremental charging stations. So the government just approved 2,600 new locations to be built over the next 3 years. But that compares to about 60,000 in-place petrol stations. So the infrastructure needs to be put in place. India is also still working towards electrification of just cities in general. They've done a great job over the last 20 years of increasing electricity to its populace. But when you start to electrify the auto fleet, that starts to put an incremental strain on the system. And then the last two things that I just want to highlight here, coal still dominates the power stack. And so while there is a lot of discussion around cleaning up the transportation sector on electrification, a lot of that power is going to come from coal. And so that's just something important to watch and think about as we talk about the pros and cons of using electric vehicles going forward, especially in countries like India where coal is such a big component of the power system. And then lastly, the transportation sector is very important for oil demand in India. Just to give you some context here, Gasoline demand over the last 10 years has grown about 9% per annum. India consumes a little over 600,000 barrels a day of gasoline, and diesel has grown at about 5% per annum, and India consumes about 1.7 million barrels a day of diesel. That makes up over 40% of their crude oil demand, and that's why, again, watching what happens in the transportation sector is going to be very important for the future forecast for crude as we step out over the next decade.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Colin, as we turn to Gauri, what's on your mind, big picture, as you think about India?
Well, just picking up that last point from Matt, we saw a very sharp decline in crude imports and refinery operations in India right after the COVID period, but we are starting to see some signs of renewed strength, particularly as India pivots to sending polymers into export markets. And just to give a couple of quick facts, in March, crude imports into India were 4.6 million barrels per day. That dropped to 2.9 in July. After a 3-month hiatus in the trade between Venezuela and India, we are starting to see some reported flows to the tune of 125,000 barrels per day in July, 187 in August. And so, let's keep in mind that India possesses some of the most complex and largest operations in the world. And so is a key fulcrum here for not only this very large domestic population, but all of the Asia-Pacific region.
All right. Well, as you can tell in the pregame, India is a massive topic. So luckily, we've got an incredible team to try to attack it. We're going to start first with Gauri. As I mentioned, she's the executive director for IHS in India. She's in New Delhi today. Welcome, Gauri. And
Thank you.
I think you've got some slides which we thought might help all of us just level set as we as all the questions are whirring around in our head. Your slides will help get us going.
Sure. Thanks for having IHS Markit here, and thanks for having me here. Thank you. I will just... So thanks again, Maynard, Michael, and Matt. I think you all laid a great, sort of context to why we are discussing India today. I think this is a question, as you said, you're being asked a lot. So really, what is at the heart of these questions? And we believe in IHS Markit that there are really 3 central questions. One is this growth in India that we've been talking about, the population growth, the economic growth, the strong fundamentals, never mind the fluctuations which have happened, say, because of COVID or other situations. We came into this year with weaker economic growth, but they really in the long-term trend, these are fluctuations. The long-term story of fundamentals still stays very good. So really, how does India manage to integrate its energy market into these global markets as it begins to impact global oil demand fundamentals, global LNG demand fundamentals, a lot of which is actually beginning to flow also from the US as a new alternative source of competitive energy supplies to traditional markets like the Middle East and Russia. As sort of major resource holders. So really it's about understanding the impacts of that energy integration into the economy, the economic transition, and the climate realities, impact on energy balances and scenarios. And finally, how does this whole Indian energy system become more market-oriented? And I think that's the journey we are in right now as we speak. The second main question is how to develop India's domestic oil and gas resources to be not entirely energy dependent from external markets. And this is really to say, the real belief is in markets here. And I think the US is the end member case story of the success of the work of markets. I mean, the whole shale oil revolution, the shale gas revolution is about when you let markets work, they work for you. And I think it's India is a historical pioneer in markets, how it can, rewind some of those lessons of the bazaar or the markets and actually still allow that to happen now. And to bring time-tested international best practices to fully develop every drop of oil and gas that is there. And again, I think this is the space of collaboration with India and the US, which lies at the heart of what is now called the Strategic Energy Partnership between India and the US, which was started by President Trump and Prime Minister Modi, and there have been successive meetings on it over the last 2 years, which have only solidified that strategic energy partnership. And finally, again, to build a competitive energy sector found on those fundamentals of markets and international best practices. And as we, deal with the larger realities of not allowing global temperature rises to be beyond 2 or even 1.5 degrees centigrade, how can renewables be integrated into the overall Indian energy picture, which, as Matt showed very clearly, is still a very coal-dominated energy system on the power side, and a very oil-dominated system, basically a very fossil fuel-dominated energy system. And really the play here is for hybrid technologies to come in that, so when the wind doesn't blow and when the sun doesn't shine, how can gas support that renewable integration? How can batteries support that integration? And that integration would come through accelerating technology partnerships, entrepreneurship, what has also come in the wake of the COVID crisis is that we're beginning to experience the benefits of a good energy transition, and we want more of it. And India is not unique in that aspect. I think the whole world is getting used to bluer skies as opposed to clouded skies. So this brings really the last aspect on my slide here, which is about supply chain diversification. That it's the geopolitics of the world and the realities of the climate. A better local air pollution. Better air quality indices, which we've gotten used to in the last 4 months, are pointing in the direction of supply chain diversification. So coming back to understanding those 3 central questions and then linking it back to the 4 critical transitions. So, these 4 critical transitions, to understand the energy transition is to understand the economic transition. And the economic transition is about how we move, where we live, how reliable we want our lives to be, and how they're all held together by a market-led transition, by market-led phenomena, as opposed to government mandates or only government incentives and subsidies. So what we've seen over the last, or play out really over the last, or accelerate over the last 5 years, is a market-led transition, which is aiding a mobility transition. And Matt, you pointed it out in terms of the government having huge ambitions towards moving towards electrification of the fleet. It also includes things like introduction of what is an equivalent of the Euro 6 standards, the BS6 standards, which have been implemented from April this year. It also includes bringing more gas into the transportation network, so bringing in more gas into the four wheels sector, and it also includes how to just utilizing, for instance, how can diesel be substituted with gas and LNG for long-haul transportation as well. In terms of the urbanization transition, again, it is about bringing in more renewables into the system to power. And this is where we've seen different states make different progress based on their wind and solar resource base. But it's also about, for instance, replacing diesel gensets, which today can be anywhere up to 90 gigawatts in a 350 odd gigawatt system to support the reliability of the system. And in terms of reliability, this is really about 24/7 power. I mean, growing up in India, I was not used to 24/7 power, but today I am. I don't need a backup system in my house. And I think increasingly that is the case for a lot of urban and other parts of India as well. So how can coal, gas, batteries really help in that reliability transition? And the reason...
Gauri, could I just ask you a question while we're there? We had Robert Bryce on, and he did a lot of writing on just the world's access to electricity. How access to electricity in India, roughly what percent of the people have access versus not, and then how many people have access to actually, dependable power, like you said? Like, do you know roughly what those stats are?
Sure. So I think Matt again showed this in a slide that, we have, under the government definitions, achieved 100% electrification. But at the household level, that is more at the village electrification level. So there is electrification But there still is, there's a difference in the definition with household electrification. So household electrification still has to catch up. And I think that is where we are facing reliability challenges in terms of continuous supply. So you can have systems which could be running on anywhere from 4 to 8 hours of backup power. So the idea is how can one move away from that reliability conundrum?
Sorry, just a follow-up question on that. You touched on transportation with gas. I know CNG has been a push by the government. How real do you think that opportunity set is, and do you expect that to expand over the next 5 to 10 years?
Absolutely. So, about $60 billion has been committed into the gas midstream and downstream infrastructure in the last 5 years. And what this includes is building new gas trunk lines. It also includes awarding new city gas distribution licenses, which will cover 70% of India's population. So what we will see is, the four-wheel segment will include CNG. So, for instance, very important player like Maruti is planning a future of CNG, possibly more than electric vehicles in the four-wheel segment. But as you pointed out, in the two-wheel segment, we could see much greater electrification happening. So gas is definitely a fuel of choice because it has an automatic arbitrage, on the economics in favor of itself relative to oil, and of course the clean air benefits.
And Gauri, I'll just like to highlight that, government has been following a policy now for some time where a lot of the government vehicles, the public vehicles, public transport is run on CNG in a lot of the metros. So in Delhi, you see a lot of the buses, the local buses running on CNG, and same with a lot of the taxis and the three-wheeler segments that you mentioned earlier, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there is a penetration that we see increasing in fact, we see city gas distribution as the fastest growing segment of gas demand in India. So again, India's growth and energy story is linked to these four economic transitions of where we live, how we move, how reliable our lives get in a market-led framework. However, having said that, we still have to address underlying climate and water stress issues. Now, even coming into this COVID year of 2020, nearly 60% of India has seen temperature increases of more than 0.25 degrees since 1950. Those are all the reds on the left-hand side chart. And on the right-hand side chart, all the reds are about 50% of India, nearly 50% of India has very high water stress. Now, this, gets us into a lot of trouble with even coal power plants, because we have seen coal power plants, for instance, being challenged by water availability. And that could be a growing challenge going forward, which again points in the direction of greater gas usage, greater renewables penetration. This is coming back to the point on, how the mobility revolution transition. India's cars per capita, we expect to quadruple by 2050, given current base year levels. India's motorcycles per capita, we expect to double by 2050. So as you pointed out, Matt, a much higher baseline to start there from. And if you look at the underlying fundamentals of demographics, we always talk about the demographic dividend in India. We will add United States by 2050, about 384 million people to the urban population by 2050. And the urbanization will actually be about 53% by 2050, which, interestingly puts a lot of pressure on, for instance, air conditioning demand, which again has implications on electricity demand. So India is going to be one of the largest global markets for air conditioners, about 1 billion air conditioners by 2050. This is a World Bank methodology of categorizing the whole globe into different categories of economies. So starting with low income economies to low middle income economies to upper middle income economies to high income economies. And $10,000 per capita is regarded in economics as a magic number when a point of inflection is hit, where a lot of economic variables start going on a much higher trajectory. And we saw China reach that in 2019. We believe India will move into upper middle income, which is a category of about $4,000 per capita to about $12,000 per per capita over the next. We'll move into that band by 2033, and we will hit $10,000 per capita by about 2050 in that time frame. So, again, the reason we're all here today, with 18% of the global population and this rapidly expanding economy, India's energy demand is definitely to double. It will impact the global energy system by 11% as opposed to 7% today in 2050. Is this growth all domestically led? It depends on which fuel we're talking. So currently, if you look at all the energy basket, India relies about 34% on imports for its energy needs. And oil, if we go at current rates of consumption and the resource profile, we could be growing to 98% import dependency by 2050 and 85% in gas by 2050. Coal is a slightly better picture, but even coal import dependence is at about a third. If we look at, if we go forward, what type of a future are we envisioning here? So at IHS Markit, we undertake a scenarios-based framework wherein we look at the world in three lenses. The first lens is a world which is our base case, which is called the rivalry case, where there is, markets are working, there's interfuel competition, and there's, it's more of the same from where we are in the energy mix. And if we go in the more of the same model for India, we will still largely remain reliant on fossil fuels, and fossil fuel dependence will decline only 4 percentage points from 2020 to 2050. And renewables will get into the power segment, but will still be less than 10 percentage points. If we achieve a greater acceleration, which is, I haven't included that here in my slides, but it's called the autonomy scenario, where we see a significant shift in the technology frontier, a significant decline in the cost frontier in terms of renewables. What we see in that case is that fossil fuels could decline to as much as 45%. That will be equivalent to what India would need to do for a 2-degree scenario to pan out in the world. And if that were to happen, we could see renewables go up to about 18 percentage points, and we could see fossil fuels drastically decline by 30 percentage points. Maynard, I think at the beginning you talked about, what is this energy transition going to look like? Is it going to be electric? Is it going to be gas-led? And I think, we believe that in the next 10 to 15 years, it will be largely gas-led. Because currently, India's gas share in the energy mix is about 6%. The government wants to push this to 15% in the primary energy mix. And, back in 2010-11, we did see gas at about 11% in the primary energy mix. So we have been used to that level of usage of gas in the energy mix. What is happening currently is that as city gas demand is picking up from a very low baseline, we're also looking to expand it into the power segment to support this growth of renewables, which is a tougher proposition, a tougher economic proposition, because you're competing with cheap coal and ever cheaper renewables. And I think that is a challenge where a lot of the policy action is happening currently. And in fact, we're also working in that policy domain right now. In terms of emissions, we can't finish a slide pack on energy transitions without really looking at the emissions trajectory. If we go along our base case rivalry scenario, or our what we call the discord scenario. So in our three worldviews, the third worldview is what we call discord, where the bottom has really fallen out in terms of geopolitics, in terms of external shocks to the global system, like COVID in this case. So in both rivalry and discord, we do see what happens is the world or economies hurtle back to the least cost pathways, and those least cost pathways typically tend to be coal for India and more fossil fuel dominance. However, in the autonomy scenario, where we see a 30 percentage point decline in fossil fuel use in the primary energy mix, we do see a decline of emissions by 1%. So a much faster policy action and implementation is what is really needed. again, countries, if you put India in terms of per capita consumption with other countries, you see a mixed scenario here of India being 1.8, lowest per capita usage. But one of my theories on per capita is in India, per capita anything is very low. So I take capita slide too much. But I think one thing to point out about emissions is that one of the realities which has come up in the face of COVID is this whole issue of supply chain diversification. And India's economic structure currently is a service-led model. So it's an economy more than 50% governed by the service sector, but the population, 600 million people live on 15% of GDP in the agricultural sector. And squeezed in between these two sort of polar sides is the manufacturing sector, which has been increasingly the focus of government policies, because the service sector is in a way on its own, it's more market-led. It's been running on its own since the 1990s. It led, with Y2K, it had its huge boom, and it's now one of our biggest export earners. Agriculture, the challenge there is to raise the productivity. But I think the main focus of the government today is how can we bring the supply chains of the future into India? And I think this is where a lot of the, Make in India policies, supply chain diversification, a lot of protectionism will also, sort of protect manufacturing that comes into India. This slide, I'd like to share that, we have just launched, Dr. Daniel Yergin has just launched a new supply chain study under his leadership on the supply chains of the future for a net zero carbon future. And that is something where we will be looking very intensely into this whole question about how these supply chains are really going to be reconfigured. And finally, India is the third largest emitter, and by 2037, we will become the second largest GHG emitter, over surpassing the US in this.
Thank you, Gauri. That gave us so much to work with. We needed all that. I guess one thing is I was thinking about it, Gauri, as you went through them. If I was the government, and I'm not doing these in order, but I've got a few things on my mind. I've of course got economic growth in my mind. I'm thinking about electrification / just getting power and dependable power to as many people as possible. I'm thinking about pollution and air quality. I'm just thinking about the environment. I'm also thinking about climate and addressing climate. And then I've got energy independence, or said another way, I'm watching my reliance on others for my power. So I'm kind of solving for a lot of stuff. I've got a population, as you said, it's now 2020, and I'm going to add almost 400 million people between now and 2050. So I have an incredible challenge on my hands. And I have limited resources to try to address these things. And I probably won't be able to address all of them. But would you all, as we start there, is that a reasonable framing up of the problem if you're the government and you're trying to think through these things? Mohit, I see you nodding. What do you think?
What you just said is exactly what the government is thinking, because if there are three mantras which are part of the government energy policy, one is security, and I think what you said is really making sure that we are there in the upstream business. A lot of government companies are bidding internationally, trying to get assets, upstream asset, and obviously working on the domestic gas. We have a domestic exploration policy. The second important part is the same thing what you mentioned, is affordability. I think electricity for all to have a dependable power and also ability to pay. And therefore there is a lot of pricing issues, whether it's a power sector pricing or whether it's a gas sector pricing. That is a very important part of the government thinking, so that everybody has access to power, access to oil and gas, and also is able to pay for it. That's the second part. And the third very important, which has actually come up very recently, I think our cities have been really polluted, sustainability. And in the last 6-7 years, we have really done a lot of work. I think, again, Like when you talked about the motor vehicle, the batteries, we find it a little bit superfluous. But I think I actually wrote the electricity law for India. And a few years back, when the government started talking about Paris Convention and renewable, I actually thought that this will never happen unless you are able to build a sustainable subsidy model, particularly as Gauri said, that you have cheap coal. But what has happened in last few years is, that's a very interesting part. If you look at 2019 data, the fossil fuel generates almost 62% of the power sector. 24% comes from renewable. It's just amazing. 24, that is almost 75 gigawatt comes from renewable. And 12% comes from hydro, the large hydro dams. And 2% come from nuclear. So I would say government has focused a lot. And the best part is that even on the renewable, the pricings have come down dramatically. I think the lot of private equity with cheap financing from Japan have participated, and the pricing has come down, and therefore they are running as a base load. And again, same thing is happening on the battery side. But again, that is very slow to move.
So maybe one question for all of you is the way to understand renewables and electrification in India, is it really through the lens of a pollution policy, or is it more through the lens of a climate policy? Like what really motivates India to be drawn to renewables and electrification?
I would say there are multiple things. One is climate, one is pollution, but I think also it's important is dependability, because I think that's again an important part what the government thinks about it, that if you look at it, when the oil prices are high, then we cannot have a bull run in India. Like when the oil prices, like typically just year after US recession, India start doing well because the interest rates come down and the oil prices come down. So I would say it's a very important part that you are trying to move, like you are trying to move away from fossil fuels, and particularly imported oil and gas, and you're trying to move away. That's an important part, and obviously, and climate change is a very important commitment of our Prime Minister.
Yeah, and just to add, Mehnat, it's linked to energy independence that you would ask before, because if you see the thinking of the government in setting up the International Solar Alliance in India, it is the vision of PM Modi was that it could become someday the OPEC, an OPEC-like body, not to, of course, cartelize it, but a body which governs the solar regulations globally, headquartered out of India. And that happened also as part of the Paris Agreement. But it's part of the energy independence theme as well.
I think the one interesting trend you will see, though, and Mohit and Gauri, you should chime in, what we have seen at least is that on the renewable side, the sector has, I would say, developed more from the private sector side. Government has really pushed a lot of private investments, private investors coming in, whereas, the traditional fossil fuel sector has historically been, when Gauri mentioned, has been dominated by the government sector or government-owned entities. So that, I think you will see how the government has gone about is developing it in a very different way from the fossil fuel sector.
Could you build on that, Rajiv? Because I know you've done quite a lot of, you do M&A as well as capital markets. There's quite a lot of, there's a startup world in India that's very vibrant. We all know it's a technology-rich country. What else would you tell us about that startup community in energy technology or renewables?
I would almost now wouldn't even call it startup anymore, Mehnat. I mean, it's startup if you compare it to the long history with the vis-a-vis fossil fuel. But now, there are a lot of renewable energy companies now, pure play renewable companies, which have been operating for some time and have really grown to a pretty large size. So, and you have now companies like Azure Power, which is listed on the NYSE, public company. And there are a few others in the pipeline who are of that size, which are looking to list on one of the stock exchanges. But just going back, 10 years ago, when you would do a cap markets transaction, an IPO of an energy company, most of them were almost by definition a thermal, coal company or an oil company, and then started this government policy where renewable sector part used to be like a footnote. I mean, literally that, we also are trying, participating in the solar bid by the government, just to show that they are, pandering to the government in some way. And, fast forward 5 years, 10 years, and I would say 5 years ago, but in the last 5 years, it's really, really mushroomed. So now you have companies like Azure Power, Renew Power, Adani Green, which is Adani is a big conglomerate in India, and they started developing oil as wind and solar in a separate subsidiary, Adani Green, Continuum Wind. There are just loads of these companies, and most of this development you'll see is in the private sector. All of these are private companies. Obviously, they are helped and subsidized on the tariff by the government, but it's all on the private sector. And most of them, around all of them, I think have foreign investors. Some of them majority owned by foreign investors. So government has really made it pretty free for foreign investors to come in, and has almost incentivized them to come in and invest. Whether it's equity or debt, it's you'll find a lot of foreign lenders as well.
Just to add what Rajiv you just said, I think post Gabon, virtually, which is like the Enron, virtually most foreign investors and foreign banks stopped funding India infrastructure. And there was a big problem. I think what Rajiv rightly said, the renewal has got the interest back. I would say right now, whether it's the US Exim, OPEC, whether it's JBIC, everybody, commercial banks, foreign commercial banks, they're all active financing, Mizo Bank, they're all active financing renewable projects. And most developers are actually foreign companies. Like we do a lot of work with Petronas, the oil company from Malaysia, EDF. They've actually been quite active in India, I would say. Then every private equity has a big portfolio they build over time. So I would say this is a sector where both development, growth, and financing has all been overseas. And this sector has grown actually. 75 gigawatt is not a small number, and I would say the government wants to take it to 175 gigawatt in next 3-4 years, which again, I think we may be missing it, but we are still on the trajectory.
So this is, David, I was going to rope you in here because you're seeing everything that Latham is doing across Asia and certainly in and out of India. And to Mohit's point, starts to get this picture of it. Capital is out here and available to go into India, particularly around the renewable space. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but maybe less capital available to go into traditional spaces. And meanwhile, India itself is putting money outward bound into things. I think those tend to be traditional fossil fuel based things, but give us a sense of the flow in and out of India that you see as the head of the energy practice.
Right, thanks. No, I think those are all very good points. We have definitely seen in the past year and very much this year a real uptick in private equity type investments into India in renewables area. So that's one area that is very, very active, and that's consistent with what all the other folks have commented. I think I wouldn't say that there's no interest in traditional. What we're seeing is there are players like, if you look currently, Aramco is looking at a potential transaction that's been described in the news with Reliance Industries, a big Indian conglomerate with a big presence in energy, and that's a downstream. So that's a downstream play. We know that there are other opportunities, including a transaction that has been mentioned in the news with a large group, BPCL, so midstream downstream group that is government owned, which is for sale, and the government is actively running a sale process and looking at bringing in foreign investors. So I think in the more traditional space where we are seeing inbound investment into India, it really has tended to be more on the downstream oil and gas. Upstream, I think it's fair to say that in the most recent bid rounds, Indian companies have been the successful bidders, and there's been less active interest from foreign E&P players looking at these upstream compared to in the past. On the outbound side, I would say, where we're seeing more outbound activity would be upstream oil and gas, LNG are really notable areas for that. Most of the large Indian oil and gas companies, particularly the state-owned companies, have been and continue to be very active in owning, in some cases operating upstream assets overseas, and looking at new acquisitions. And then on the LNG side, recently Mozambique LNG is a very significant relatively new project in the sense that the financing has closed relatively recently, and 30% of that project is held by Indian public sector undertakings, so state-owned oil and gas companies, and they are 30% in the equity of the project and off-takers from that project. So very, very significant in that one.
So I was just about to say, we're 45 minutes in. This is the first time we've talked about LNG, and we haven't mentioned Colin's favorite flavor yet, nuclear. Why, Gauri, in those slides you showed us with various scenarios, why isn't natural gas making a bigger dent in all of this? And does nuclear get any discussion in India?
Yeah, so, I think gas is the flavor of the decade. I would say that it had a setback. I would say it had some setbacks in terms of, certain surprises on the upstream and, some problems about gas getting into the power sector. Because at the end of the day, if gas, wherever we've seen in the world higher utilization of gas in the power and fertilizer sectors, those tend to be the baseline sectors, the bulk load sectors. And unless that happens, just city gas or refining in petrochemicals can't lead to very high penetrations of gas. So I think what is happening now is we've moved from a situation, I would say, around 2014 till up to 2014, we used to use the term, and I'm sure Rajiv and Mohit are quite familiar with it, of policy paralysis. And I think we got through this phase of policy paralysis, right, by about 2014, when we had new domestic pricing policies that came in on the upstream side, which actually have incentivized $12 billion, almost $12 billion in deep water gas upstream developments, which will come on stream in this decade. At the same time, we will have new city gas distribution networks, new trunk pipelines, new LNG terminals, all being built in this decade. So I think this decade is the make or break decade for gas in India. So I don't think it's a story, it's actually a growth story. It's, despite these challenges, gas has been growing about 10% in demand. So that's, the demand growth. So gas is still a growth story in India. It's only the penetration in the energy mix has to claw back some of the lost space on gas utilization into power. And I think that is a work in progress right now.
Sorry, if I could ask a follow-up question on that. On your donut chart, you showed that the share of hydrocarbons in the mix in 2050 falls to 72% from 76%, if I remember correctly. But
right.
The donut is bigger. So what is the absolute growth between the 2020 donut and the 2050 donut that the 72 and the 76 are being applied to?
So it's almost a doubling. It's a total doubling of the size of the market, of the size of the energy pie.
So 72 is against a donut that's twice as big.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that growth is there. I mean, that's the growth which brings India into 11% of the world energy system. Yeah.
So maybe one question, I think that it's come up time and time again when it comes to how do we solve the world's global climate problem. And it frequently comes up that if we could get people to stop using wood and dung, that would be so helpful for their health and for air quality and for the climate. Is there sort of an explicit policy that has where they're trying in India to reduce that that type of energy consumption. What would you tell us all about that? Because we hear a lot about it, and I didn't want to miss a chance to ask you guys about it.
If you look at what the Prime Minister has been talking about, is trying to make sure that women in this country have access to better quality fuel, and I think that LPG is one very important part of that whole scheme, and that has moved pretty well. But I think earlier you asked a question on nuclear, and I wanted to answer that question. That's an important part. I deposed in the Parliament on the nuclear liability law, and nuclear is actually a very, very central force for the government thinking. Because of the liability law, the US, the Japanese, the Russians, the French, they're all very active. I would say Russians and the French are more active than the US and the Japanese because of the liability law. But there are a lot of, I think the sites have been acquired, the pricing negotiations are on. So I would say in next few years, you will see these 4 or 5 big nuclear plants, particularly I think the Russians and the French would probably will find a way to finance and bring up a nuclear power plant in spite of the liability law, what we have. But I think the US is a little bit behind the schedule.
So is we spend a lot of time in the US, like daily. It's an obsession now. The election's coming. I got to ask, is Kamala Harris getting people excited in India? Does that get a lot of news?
Well, I think her Indian, Indian origins are well recognized. But I think the U.S.-India relationship, went quite further ahead in this administration through the Strategic Energy Partnership, and there is this whole. But it's 8% of India's oil and LNG needs today are being met by the US. So it's emerged as this new competitive source of energy. And I think that is something which would continue. It's more commercial in nature, so it would continue, I would think, regardless of who really is in the White House. But I think this one area, Maynard, in relation to investments you were talking about, which is emerging, is this whole new focus on carbon capture. And as it can be linked to enhanced oil recovery. So we're seeing, sort of the first signs of an interest in that. There's been a national task force that has been constituted on carbon capture as well. And certain pilot sites have been identified to utilize this technology. And, there are certain, I think, American companies who are looking at bringing in those technologies here as well. So.
That's great. Is there one country that India, do you think, models itself on when it thinks about energy policy? I mean, Japan, Mohit, you were mentioning Japan does a lot in the country. Japan is another, huge economy with no natural energy sources. I'm just curious, is there a model? China has had a lot of success. Which country comes up the most as being the place to model itself on?
I think on the upstream side, it has been Norway. So a lot of the initial development of the upstream regulator, the Director General Hydrocarbons, was modeled on Norwegian. There was a lot of discussion with Norway. I would say in the real setup of the energy system in India, Russia, and on the gas midstream, there's a lot of there's a US-India gas task force now in place, and a lot of work happening under the Asia Edge program, which governs the US's Indo-Pacific focus. And that comes through the whole, US aid, US TDA, all that sort of architecture of funding, which is coming into India. And we see a lot of relations between FERC. I see FERC very active on the ground in India these days with the gas regulator.
Well, maybe this is a fantastic conversation. We're so appreciative. We probably, unfortunately, have to wrap up, but maybe I could ask an unfair question of each of you as we hang up. What's the one thing, because we're all going to go back to our day jobs, and we all know India is so important. What's the one thing you would leave us with that we all need to have in mind when it comes to India?
I guess, Maynard, I'll pick up from what you said at the introduction. We all know India is big. India has huge energy needs, but not everyone understands India. And a lot of folks, and we do this every day, a lot of investors sometimes shy away from India just because they think it's so regulated and it's very difficult and challenging. So I guess my thought would be that it's maybe many years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that was the case, but not today. And now it's a very welcoming country and very welcoming to foreign investors. The laws have changed. The government is very reformist. And so don't be shy and certainly look to India for your future investments.
I like that. Mohit, how about you?
I would say, again, just to add what Rajiv just said, that almost in the entire oil and gas sector and the entire energy sector, power sector, non-conventional energy, renewable, 100% of FDI, foreign direct investment, is permitted. So the entire board can be foreigners. Every director can be foreign. Every dollar of equity can be foreign owned. Every dollar debt can be foreign. So I would say really this is really an open market, very badly misunderstood because of, like what Gauri said about the policy paralysis we had for maybe 5 years back, for at least 5-10 years. And because of that, I think on the ease of doing business, we have moved significantly from 139 to almost 70 now. So we have really we covered halfway. We have a long way to go. But I would say the government is determined in 5 years, moving almost 60-70 points on ease of doing business is not a small feat. And particularly when the bureaucracy is very difficult. The government is determined to make India a welcome place, whether it's Make in India, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's growth. I would say clearly we are right now, if you look at a GDP, we are under $3 trillion. And clearly, I think we all understand we will be $5 trillion shortly and then again $10 trillion. And I would say this will be a great business market for energy and both conventional, non-conventional, storage, everything. And I would say almost everything is permitted. So this is a great market. And I think we have a lot of good people who understand Indian market and who can support making global companies make right decisions in India.
Great. David, how about you?
Yeah, I would just add that, I think we're all aware that imports of energy are going to continue to be a very significant part of India's energy mix for going forward for some time to come. And that will mean necessarily that Indian energy companies are going to be active overseas as well as domestically. And that will bring a lot of opportunities, players overseas to international oil and gas companies, international energy companies to transact with Indian energy companies. And I think many have already, but those who haven't will find that they're great partners. They're sophisticated deal teams, great partners, and it's really very exciting to see.
Well, Gauri, you were our leadoff pitcher. You got us going. Now you're our closer. What would you leave us with as we think about India? I would have done a cricket analogy, but I'm not that savvy. But what would you tell us as we wrap up?
We'll go with baseball. I think, Rajiv, Mohit, and David have summarized it really well about the growth. I agree with that, absolutely. I view India as a growth story in the short term and medium term, and as a value play in the long term. So when you look at growth, look at short to medium, value, long term, because that is when the economics takes us to, the upper middle income category as a country. And that itself leads to accelerators coming in. So.
Well, Gauri, you wrap that up like a research analyst. If I wouldn't get in trouble with Jamie and Dan, we'd try to get you to open our New Delhi office for us. But I know Matt appreciated that summary. Anyway, thank you so much to all of you. That was a great discussion. There's so much to cover. We couldn't possibly cover it, but you guys did a fantastic job. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye, team.